Hey, this is Aria, and I've had a few people ask me about doing a tutorial for geometry nodes, and even though we can't use them to create a simulation, there are ways to use them for things like motion graphics. So I thought it would be cool to add it in every so often with our simulation tutorials. If you do enjoy this tutorial, make sure to let me know in the comments so that I can add more in the future. Also, make sure to like and subscribe, and if you want to get a copy of my original animation file, you can just head over to my Patreon page and sign up to become a member. You'll also be supporting the growth of this channel. Awesome, so let's get started. So before we get started, just keep in mind that I am using Blender 2.92, and this is the official release, which if I click here, you can see has the geometry node editor. So make sure you've got either this version here, or you could probably also use Blender 2.93 Alpha, but so far I haven't had a chance to test this inside that alpha version. Once you've got that, you can hit A to select everything in the scene and hit delete. I of course used a character for mine, and this will probably work with a lot of different models, but I did find some problems with different ones, so if you want to follow along with exactly what I did, you can head over to mixamo.com and just sign up for a free account. And if you just scroll down on the main page here, you can see that we've got this mannequin here, and I've tried this and this worked fine for this. And as well, I used this character here just because I wanted a little bit more detail with the particles. Next, you can click on the animations, and feel free again to use whatever animation you want, but for mine, I used this animation here, so you can type in twerk. Then you just want to click this and you'll add the animation to your character. Feel free to change the settings any way you like if you want to make this go a little bit slower. Or if your character has larger arms, you might want to increase your arm space just so that things aren't crashing into each other. But again, keep in mind that this won't matter as much because we're just going to be using this essentially as an outline for our particles. Once you've got that, you can click download. Then make sure this is set to FBX. 24 frames per second, and then click download. Back into Blender, we can head up to File, Import, FBX, then just find the file on your system and click Import. Now we can just zoom into our character here, and if I was to hit N on the keyboard and bring up the transform settings, you can see that our character is quite short, so what we're going to do is just hit S, and depending on what size your character is, you just want to make this roughly somewhere around there for myself, and if your character is a little bit larger, you can scale it a little bit more, but this is roughly about 5.5 to 6 feet. Now we can just head up to the right here, and we're just going to open up our armature. If we just click here, we can turn on some of our restriction toggles. Then for now, we're just going to turn the armature off in both the viewport and the render. Make sure to select your mesh, and now we can start adding our geometry nodes. So let's bring our mouse just down to the left here until you see a little plus symbol. Then click, and we're just going to drag this up to split our window in half. Then we can click here, and we're going to find our geometry node editor and select that. Just like we're adding a shader, we need to click new before anything happens, so let's select this. Then you'll see that we got these two nodes here, and essentially this is just like an in and out. And since there's nothing in the middle here, nothing at all is being changed. So we've just got our mesh going in and out the exact same way. And you'll see how simple these can be and how effective we can make them. First thing that we're going to do is, just like any other menu, we can hit Shift A to bring up our search. And feel free to go through all of these and sort of check out the different options that we have. But the first thing we want to do is go to Point and select Point Distribute. We can just drop this in just like the shader editor. Then what happens is our geometry gets replaced by all of these little tiny points. So if I was to just zoom in, you can see that it's not even geometry. In fact, you can't even click back on it. So what you can do is just click over here on the mesh if you unselect it. Let's leave our density for now, and the reason why is if we get too much with our density before we add our geometry, we can start to freeze up the system. So we're just going to leave that for now, and then we'll just work backwards. The next node that we are going to add is in the same menu, and it's called Point Instance. What this is the node that adds our geometry. So you can see as soon as we added that, everything disappeared. So just like we're doing a particle system, we can hit Shift A, Mesh, and we can add an Icosphere. open up this little side menu and we want to set the subdivisions to 1 just so that it's not as heavy. Then let's just move this out of the way, so GZ, and just drag this down. Because we've got nothing in our viewport, we need to just go over to the right here and we can select our mesh, which will bring back our geometry nodes. Let's select this little window here and select Icosphere. Then now you'll see that we've actually got some geometry here, and now we can select our mesh in the viewport, which makes it a little bit easier. You'll notice that we can either use an object or a collection, and in this case we do want to add an additional particle, so you can just select the first icosphere, hit Shift D, then we can just bring this over right beside it. Since we are using a collection, we need to create one, so click and select both of these, hit M, new collection, and then I'm just going to name this particles. You'll see that we've got this collection up here now with our 2 icospheres inside. Make sure to select back onto this collection, otherwise when we add things, they'll go inside this collection. Now we can select back onto our character and select collection. Then in this little window here, we're just going to select the particle collection. You'll see right away that things look really weird, so I'm not really sure why it does this, but there is a quick way to fix it. If you just uncheck whole collection, it will go back to normal, and as well, it will still use both of our particles. Next thing we want to do is deal with our size, and there's a few ways you can do that. You could just select the particle, and you'll see that if we scale it in object mode, nothing happens. But if you go into edit mode by hitting tab, you can scale it, and these will shrink quite a bit. But since we want to reuse this particle, there's another way we can do that. So I'm just going to go back into object mode, select back on our mesh. Then if you hit Shift A, you can go to attribute. Then you'll see that we've got a couple different options here. So you could use this node here, which is attribute fill. And if you were to type in scale for the attribute, you'll see that you can get a uniform scale using this node. Since we want to get a variation of sizes, what we're going to do is hit Shift A, attribute, and we're going to select attribute randomize. If we hook this in here, the same thing, you'll see now that we've got these minimum and maximum values as well as a seed option. If I was to change the size, you can see that nothing's really happening because with these attribute nodes, we always need to define what our attribute is. So again, we're going to type in scale. If I zoom in, you can see that our particles are a different variation of size. I'm just going to set this a little bit higher to say something like 0.3. You could also use the minimum value too. If you didn't want really tiny particles, you could set this to something like 0.1. And you'll see that our smallest particles are a little bit larger now. That's pretty much it. You can also duplicate this node here and drop it in. And if you wanted to do something like a different rotation, you can just type in rotation. If I go back to frame 1, I could just set a key quickly here on the maximum, head to the final frame in the animation, and then just type in something like 50 and add a new keyframe. Finally, now that we're done all of that, we can come back to our original node here and set a density of 2. There is also another option here that you can select, which if you type in a value here, you can see that we've got a minimum separation between our particles. So I'm just going to set mine to something super low like 0.03. Finally, now if I hit play, you can see that everything is attached to our animation and it's looking great. I'm getting about 14 frames per second. Now that we've got our dancing character, I'm just going to head back to frame 1, and now we can add our Taurus. So Shift A, Mesh, and we're going to click Taurus. Then we just want to make this a little bit thinner, so head over to the minor radius and type in 0.15. Next, we just want to scale this, so we're going to hit S to scale and type in 2.25. Then G and Z to bring this up and hit 3. If I hit 1 on the numpad, you can see that this is a little bit off center, so I also am just going to bring this over by hitting G and X. If you just hold Shift, you can just bring this over ever so slightly. This isn't attached to anything, so the quickest way to do that is to attach this Taurus to the armature. So just head up to the right and we can turn our armature back on, and for now I'm just going to turn the mesh off just for a second just so that I can show you exactly what we're going to do. In this case, we do want to get this as still as possible, so the best bone to use will be this one here. The quickest way to parent this is just to select the Taurus, then Shift and select our armature, Then up on the left, we can click here and go into the pose mode. Then all you need to do is just select whatever bone you want. So I'm just going to left click on this bone here, hold Control, hit P, and select bone. To get back into object mode, let's just go up here and select object mode. We can turn our armature back off and our mesh back on. If we hit play, you can see that our Taurus matches our animation. Back to frame 1 again, and we want to rotate this Taurus now. Hit N to bring up the transform settings, and let's right click and insert a single keyframe for the Z rotation. Click here to head to the final frame in the animation. Select the Z rotation, and we're going to type in 2500. Right click and insert a new single keyframe. To make sure that our animation is even throughout, we're going to hover over the timeline, hit T and select linear, which now gives us a linear progression instead of a Bezier curve. Back to frame 1, and this will be a little bit hard to see, so I'm just going to quickly add a material, and you don't need to do this, but this is just for visual, so if you want this, just select the Taurus and add a new material. Then click here to add an additional material and click New. In the 3D viewport, hit Tab to go into object mode. Let's select this to go into face select. Alt and let's click to select that entire loop, then back in the materials, click Assign and set the base color to something different. Then if we just turn on the material preview and hit play, you can see that we've got our spinning Taurus. And like I said, this is just for visuals. You don't need this for anything other than just to see how fast this spins. Now that we have that, we can just bring our geometry nodes back up. Again, make sure you're in the geometry node editor and then select New. We could probably use this and copy and paste some nodes, but for the sake of learning, we're just going to start again. And as well, just a good tip, be careful of copying geometry nodes over between objects, because you'll notice on this one here, we only needed a density of 2 to completely cover our mesh, but for this one here, we're going to need well over 1,000. So just keep that in mind, that if you were to copy that to this, you would probably freeze your computer. Select the Taurus, Shift A. Again, we're going to go to Point and select Point Distribute. Then right away, you'll see that this looks a lot different than before. Our points are a lot bigger, and it looks like there's a lot less of them. You could hit Control A and apply your scale, which will change this slightly, but we're just going to leave this like this for now. So we can type in 1500, and that's going to give us tons of points. Shift A again, and we're going to add a point instance again. This time we can just leave it to Object. Click here, and we're just going to select our Icosphere, which is just this particle here. Of course, this is quite large, so we need to deal with the scale again, so Shift A, Attribute, and let's click Attribute Randomize. Then set this to something super small like 0.02. As well, we need to define our attribute, so let's type in Scale. Then immediately it will be activated. So that's pretty much the same node tree that we had for our character, except for the rotation. So now we just want to make a little bit of space, and now what we can do is make our Taurus look a little bit more dynamic. And there's a few tutorials that use this same idea, but we're just going to adapt it to our simulation. So what we want to do is basically just have a fall off with our particles. And the way we can do that is by identifying a point in space, which is called a vector point, and using that to calculate where our particles fall off from. I know this can seem a little bit confusing, but once you do this a few times, you'll get the hang of it. Shift A, Attribute, and this time we're going to select Attribute Vector Math. So just so that we can visualize it a little bit better, let's add that now. So we'll hit Shift A, and we're just going to add a circle. We want to rotate this on the Y, so RY, and type in 90. Let's bring this up to the height of our Taurus, so G, Z, and 3. Then if I just go into top orthographic, we can hit G, and then Y, and just bring this down until our pivot point is somewhere in the center. Then if you want to scale this down, it doesn't really matter, but just to give it a better representation, I'm just going to scale this around our Taurus. So now that we've got this, you can see that we've got a pivot point, and this represents our vector point. So this is at a specific point in 3D space, and it's not hard to figure out where that is. We just need to go up here, and all 3 of these make up our vector point. So now if we click back on our Taurus, we can utilize this object here by hitting Shift A and searching for Object. Then if we click here, or we can use the eyedropper, we can just select our circle. As well, we want to make sure that we set this to relative, Otherwise, we're just going to be using the 0, 0, 0 coordinate. Like I said, we are using a distance, so we're going to click here and go to distance. And if I just hover over it, you can see that it says distance between A and B. So we need to compare two different things. So the first thing we're going to do is type in position. And now we want to compare that to our circle. But like I said, we want to get a specific vector point. So instead of having an attribute, let's click vector. Select this and then hook it up to the B slot. Finally, we're going to create our actual result, which is going to be a distance attribute. So we'll type in distance there as well. Now that we've created our attribute, we actually need to do the math to calculate that. So again, Shift A, attribute, and let's select attribute math and click this in. In this case, we're going to use a multiplication math, so let's select multiply. Then the two attributes that we want to multiply together is our scale, which will multiply by our distance, and then finally send that back to our scale. Then right away you'll see that we've got this point here, and as our particles get closer to this point, they get really small, and the further away from this vector point, the larger they get. Just like in the shader editor, we can use the color ramp to just flip things, so let's search for color and select the attribute color ramp, and the order of this node is important, so this needs to go right in between the vector and the attribute math. Otherwise, this won't work at all. Then all we need to do is grab these two toggles and switch sides. You'll see that nothing happened, and that's because with any of these attribute nodes, we need to define what we want to do. So in this case, what we want to do is change our distance, and of course, just set it back to our distance. So we just type in the same for both. Then now if I play with these, you can see that we can get different types of fall off. One last thing we can do just to make this a little bit larger of a ring, Shift A, type in attribute one more time and select attribute math. And next we'll select divide. And we just want to increase the size of our distance, so we can type in distance under A. Then for B, we'll select float and type in 2.5. Then finally, we always need to tell it a result. So again, we're going to put that back into the distance. And essentially what we did is we just took the distance value, divided it by 2.5, and then set it back to the distance. You can just use this to change your fall off by going up or down. Now that we've got that, I'm just going to take this down a little bit. It doesn't need to be in our way. And we can make this a little bit more dynamic. If I was to hit play, you can see that this kind of does the same thing over time, and it's sort of staying static, so let's make that move. So we want to make this circle right here rotate around our particles, so let's hit Shift A. And the best way to do this is just to add an empty, G, Z, and 3 to bring this up. Then you want to click your circle, Shift, select the empty. I'm just going to hide the mesh for now just so that it's out of the way. Then select the circle, Shift, select the empty, Control P, and select object. Again, if I hit play, nothing is happening, so we want to do one more parent. So let's click away, select our second empty, Shift, select our Taurus, Control P, and select object. Finally, now if we hit play, you can see that we've got everything attached. But we're going to take this one step further by adding an additional rotation value to our empty. So not only will this rotate with our Taurus, but it's also going to rotate on its own. So again, frame 1, select the second empty. If we just head up to the right and open up our Taurus, you can see that we've got both of our empties and our circle inside. Then to make this a little bit more dynamic, let's give our empty its own rotation. So again, on frame 1, right click and insert a single keyframe on the Z rotation. Head to the final frame in the animation, and then we're going to type in something like 5,000 so that it spins about twice as quick as our Taurus. Right click and insert a new keyframe. And you'll see if I hit play that everything is sort of speeding up over time, so again we want to set this to linear. So while we've got our empty selected, hover over the timeline, hit T, and select linear. We also want to do this for the Taurus, so select the Taurus, hover over the timeline, T, and select linear. Save and then hit play, and you can see now that we've got one constant speed. Let's just quickly turn off our empty and our circle, and turn our mesh back on. Then now if we hit play, you can see that it's a nice smooth animation. And now we can move on to our other geometry. So again, back to frame 1, Shift A, and let's go to Mesh, Plane, hit S to scale, and type in 50. Then, as always, I like to utilize my space, so I'm going to hit G and Y. Then type in 35 just to bring this back. Hit Tab to go into edit mode. Right click, and then we want to subdivide this, and then we want to set the number of cuts to 75. So you can either hit 1 or 2 on your keyboard, or just select here to go into either vertex or edge select mode. Hold Alt and click to select this back row of edges. Now we want to bring this up, so let's turn on our proportional editing just so that we get a nice fall off. But you'll see if I hit G and Z and bring this up, scroll down on my mouse wheel, that we do get a nice ramp, but it's almost like an S shape, so we're just going to change the fall off type. So if we click here, we can select sharp. Then now if we hit G and Z again, you can see that when we bring it up, it's more of a ramp. After you hit G and Z, just type in 25. While we've got our mesh selected, we're going to right click and go to edge split and select that. You'll see that nothing happens, but if we tab to go back into object mode, then just head over to the modifiers, click here, and let's add a subdivision surface. And right away you'll see that we've got something like the effect that we want. We can set the levels to 2, and let's go to advanced and bring the quality down to 1, which will just give us this nice circular square look. And that's it for that, but we don't want this to be see-through, so let's click our plane and Shift D to duplicate. Hit escape, head over to the modifiers and remove our subdivision. This looks a little bit messy, so let's just bring it down by hitting G, Z, hold Shift, and we'll just drag this down, just until our faces aren't crashing. And now we can add our materials and lighting. Since we've already got this window down here, let's just bring this up. And instead of going into the shading tab, we can just click here and go to the shader editor. Let's select this and go to world. And as well, let's turn on our render preview just so that we can see. We've just got a gray reflection just because our background is gray, so let's change that by heading over to the right and selecting the world properties. Click on this dot, and then we're going to select environment texture. Once you've got that, everything is going to go pink just because we've got no file selected, so let's click open. Then if you want to use the HDRI that I'm using, just go to the link in the description and you can download this for free. But keep in mind that this is quite large, so I also made a 1K version and you can download that as well. Select that and click open. Let's change the strength to 0.75, and then you can just leave this transparent just because we're not going to really look outside of our background here. And now we can start adding our materials. So instead of having our world, let's click here and go back into object shading. Then the first thing we're going to do is select our ground plane. For now, I'm just going to select the one that's sitting underneath, so it's our second ground plane. Then click new. We're going to give this a slightly blue color. Set the metallic to 1 and set the roughness to 0.4. Just make note of which material this is here. You can even name this ground if you want. Then we can select our other plane with our circles, and instead of clicking new, we can just select our ground material. Let's click here to make a copy of it just so that we don't change our other material, and set our roughness just a little bit lower to something like 0.3. If I click away, you can see that it's looking a little bit weird. We don't really have a good reflection or anything like that, so since we're using Eevee today, we just want to make sure that we add a few settings. So let's head over to the render properties here. Then again, make sure you're in Eevee, and then if we turn on ambient occlusion, right away you'll see that we got a much nicer result. We also want to turn on bloom, which will come in later on. And as well, really important, let's click screen space reflections. Now if you want, you could just select your plane that's underneath, hit G and Z, hold Shift, and you can just bring this down a little bit, which will just give us a nicer shadow. So let's just head over to the right, and we're going to select our first icosphere and click new. Select our base color. We want to set this to something blue, and just so that we get a nice strong value, let's click the value and set this to 5. Next, we want to make sure that we add metallic, so let's bring that all the way up to 1. And then we want to bring this quite a bit down, so let's bring this all the way down to something like 0.05. Let's select our other particle, click new. So we're just going to do a dark gray color. Again, we want to set the metallic to 1, and let's bring the roughness all the way down to 0. Then once we add our final light, these will really show up. First, we want to make sure that we've got our overlays turned on, and we're back into flat shading. I'm also just going to close this just so that we can see a little bit better. You can leave it open if you want. Then again, make sure you're on frame 1, hit Shift A, then we'll go down to light and select point. In the collections, let's turn on our armature again, and basically what we want to do is just bring this light up just until it's somewhere in the center. You just want to have this completely inside the chest. Then we can just use the same method that we did before, so let's turn off our mesh for a sec just so we can see. Make sure that we've got our light selected. Shift select our armature, and then up on the left, let's go into pose mode. And then again, you just want to select whatever bone you think will work best for you. I'm just going to click this one here, Control P, and select bone. Head up to the top again, let's click here and back into object mode. Turn the armature off and the mesh back on. Then we can head up to the right and we can turn our render preview back on. Head up to the right and select our point light. Then into the object data properties, let's set this to a deep orange. And set the power to 2500. I also made my radius a little bit bigger, just so that it had a larger spread. And that's looking really good. Next we want to add our camera, so Shift A and select camera. Then I just like to get my viewport somewhere in front of where I want my camera to be. Hold Control, Alt, and hit 0 on the numpad. You can just go up to the transform settings and just set these to how you want. So let's head into the camera properties, so select your camera, and let's select this little icon here and add some depth of field. Open this up, and then for our focus object, a good thing to focus on would be our point light, so let's select point, and then set the f-stop to something like 0.2. Then finally, if you want to fill in some of the background, I just added some cones and used the same method as I did for the ground. And then finally we can head into the rendering tab. Save, render, and render image. So if you want to learn more about geometry nodes, let me know in the comments and I'll add some more of these in the future. As well, like and subscribe. And if you want to get a copy of my original animation file, head over to my Patreon page and sign up to become a member. I'll see you soon. Bye!